Hello and welcome to Press TV's debate. I'm Marzieh Hashemi. Donald Trump's first executive Muslim ban barred entry of Syrians fleeing their country to the United States indefinitely. This is how concerned the U.S. president was with the fate of Syrians. Now, after a chemical attack that Washington is blaming on the government in Damascus, although the Syrian government turned over all of its chemical weapons to the OPCW in 2014, Trump suddenly feels for the Syrian people, so much so that he ordered 59 Tomahawk missiles to hit a Syrian base. Problem solved? Are just the beginning of greater problems to come. Stay with us as we take a look at the latest on the U.S. Strike on Syria. I'd like to welcome my guest to the program from the Answer Coalition, Mr. Brian Becker, out of Washington, D.C., an independent scholar out of New York, Mr. Peter Sinha. Thank you both for being with us. So let's start this off in New York with Mr. Peter Sinha. I want to read actually a tweet from Donald Trump prior to becoming president. He said, "We should stop talking, stay out of Syria and other countries that hate us, rebuild our own country and make it strong and great again, USA." What happened?
Well, Trump certainly has used isolationist phrases when he was running for president. And even a few days before the attack, he basically was saying the U.S. was not really interested in replacing the Assad regime. It was really focusing on the destruction of ISIS. What has happened is that this was seen as a very concerted response to what Trump had said. So in other words, Assad saw this as basically a green light that he could do what he wanted. And by using these planes, now Tillerson said there's a very high level of confidence that Syrian planes did this, and there's a very high level of confidence that this was a nerve agent sarin gas. So all of these things are done. The attacks were done on the air base as a response, because if there had not been a response like this, it would mean there would be a normalization of the use of weapons of mass destruction.
So, Mr. Sinha, staying with you, why couldn't the U.S. staying with you, sir? Why couldn't the U.S. then wait until there was an actual investigation into what really went on?
Well, one reason is that a few hours later, a Russian plane was seen to be bombing in the area of the hospital where they were treating the patients. So this is an area that is in active warfare. It was bombed again today. It's not an area you can just walk into and do an investigation.
Okay, so let me turn to Mr. Becker. So, Mr. Becker, I guess investigations are no longer necessary to infringe upon the sovereignty of a country. Your take on all this, why couldn't the U.S. wait until an investigation by international entities like the OPCW, that they could have actually looked into this, especially being the fact that the Syrian government turned over all of their chemical agents to the OPCW, verified by them years ago?
Well, I believe that the reason the United States government decided to bomb first and ask questions later, and using the formula by the bombers that they have a high degree of confidence that they're right, cannot be possibly understood to be a viable explanation. The United States government has no right to bomb Syria. Syria is technically at peace with the United States. The UN Charter makes it clear that member states cannot attack each other and launch military strikes against each other, except in the case of imminent self-defense. Syria poses no threat to the United States. The U.S. government and the Trump administration decided for political purposes, and I believe it was essentially for domestic political purposes, that bombing Syria following the release by activists who are linked to an al-Qaeda-controlled area of Syria, that's Idlib. In other words, there's no independent journalists there, no independent investigators. These come from activists linked with al-Qaeda. Based on their evidence, the Trump administration wanted to strike Syria for a couple reasons. One is CNN and the Washington Post had been condemning Trump for not acting. They've been condemning Trump since he took office, actually since he won the presidency. And this was a surefire way to mute his critics domestically, and it has succeeded. You now see Republicans and Democrats, including the mainstream media, which has been so critical of him, applauding Trump for acting as Obama did, or as George W. Bush did, or as Clinton did during the Yugoslav situation. In other words, bombing other countries. That brings unity for the Republicans and Democrats. It provides some measure of relief for Trump, who's under a lot of criticism. Now, why would the Assad government, when it has cleared East Aleppo, when it is on the verge of annihilating al-Qaeda, when it has victory at hand or in sight, why would it do the one thing that would invite foreign intervention by the United States? That would be the use of a particular weapon, weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons. Why would they, under these circumstances, use that one weapon that would invite foreign intervention? That makes no sense.
Well, let's pose that question to our guests in New York. What about that, Mr. Senate? Why would the Syrian government choose this time to do that when obviously they have the upper hand? They have been actually allowing some of the terrorists to board buses and leave areas in order to make sure that those areas were safe for civilians. So why now? Why would they kill their own people?
Well, this is basically an escalation of the use of other agents such as chlorine gas that they've been using in recent months and barrel bombs. I think by Trump saying that we weren't interested in replacing the Assad regime, I think this signaled that they felt that they could do just about anything.
Why kill their people? They have been, sir, they have been in a battle against Daesh. They have been in a battle against the terrorists, and they have been successful. All of a sudden, they just decide then to kill their own people. In any situation, we have to ask, then what would be the benefit for the Syrian government at this point in time than to decide to gas its own people?
Well, the Syrian government has seen millions and millions and millions of its people cross the borders and decide not to stay in Syria, that's under the control of the Assad dynasty, but to continue on to Europe or to Lebanon or to Turkey. So people are voting with their feet against the Assad regime. It's a long civil war now. It's 6 years. And it's a nasty civil war, and there are a lot of different parties. And the U.S. is certainly not aligned with most of them. But the focus on the war against ISIS continues, and the al-Qaeda is growing stronger.
Go ahead, Brian Becker, you want to comment? I mean, your other guest didn't really answer the question, which is the Assad government is winning the war. At this time, the American government has been made almost irrelevant. The peace talks in Kazakhstan had Russia, Iran, and Turkey as the guarantors for a peace process. So here, after 6 years of long-fought civil war, more than 100,000 Syrian Arab army soldiers have died battling Daesh and ISIS and al-Qaeda. They're dead too. They've been fighting to defend their country from terrorist actions. They're on the verge of victory, on the eve of victory. The only thing that can prevent victory would be the intervention by the American government, which had said before, don't cross the red line of using chemical weapons. Use that one weapon. See, they wouldn't use that one weapon. It doesn't make any sense. And your other guest is just echoing the bombers, that would be the American government and the Pentagon, to give this implausible explanation for why they carried out this attack. And by the way, when Trump said Assad must go is no longer the principal goal of the United States, that doesn't mean that the United States is not militarily active in Syria. It's working with the YPG to capture Raqqa, the caliphate capital in the eastern part of Syria, and to create what I believe will be an American zone of influence in a federalized, de facto federalized Syria. So just not getting rid of Assad in Damascus doesn't mean America doesn't have ambitions in Syria. It certainly does.
All right, stay with me, both my guests. Let's take a quick break, crossing over to our Facebook page and see what some of our viewers have had to say on this subject.
The U.S. is not exempt from its own war crimes. Russia has to do more to give us confidence in supporting Syria and Russia itself. The question is, can Russia unilaterally strike Somalia or Afghanistan without U.S. consent? What were the S-400 and S-300 doing? since their multiple launchers and interceptors. Israel would strike and America would bomb Syria as if the country were a free land for exporting and maintaining terrorist groups by America and the West. Two wrongs don't make a right. If there were use of chemical weapons, the U.S. should have sought a UN resolution to investigate. This cowboy diplomacy will certainly backfire and weaken the United Nations' resolve to fight terrorism. They don't want to find the truth, just take over Syria. Terrorist organizations are losing in Syria, therefore they're trying to defame Assad and to stop the Syrian army's advance all over Syria. We have no proof Assad did the gas attacks. We presume. America did this in Iraq too, remember? Assad's chemical agents were removed in 2013, period. Why should Assad kill his own people? They support him. He's winning too. Also in doing this, you realize we side with the terrorists. Fact. Wake up. You're being fooled. We don't allow refugees in, but all of a sudden care after the gas attacks.
Well, Peter Sinat, one of our viewers said they do not want to find the truth. And actually, former Congressman Ron Paul commented about the reason Washington carried out this airstrike. And he said that they are terrified that peace is going to break out regarding the neocons in the U.S. Your take on all of this?
Well, it's true the neocons had always wanted a lot of intervention in the Middle East, but we have seen President Trump basically formulate a somewhat isolationist foreign policy, and I believe the reason he changed so dramatically is because he was so convinced that this is a major step. This would mean accepting this, what happened would mean accepting the normalization of weapons of mass destruction. Now, as far as investigations, it's very hard to hold an investigation in an area that's being actively bombed and where the U.S. would admit there are a lot of elements on the ground exactly in that area that are against the United States to begin with. But there's no doubt about that. It's because this was an extraordinary action that an extraordinary means was taken.
It's interesting. You're talking about extraordinary actions, and we see this, unfortunately, more and more places all the time. It reminds me of a recent situation we saw in Yemen where more than 100 people were killed, civilians, bombed, slaughtered by Saudi Arabia, yet there was no outcry, no sanctions, no talk of any type of action against Saudi Arabia, the same country that, again, we go back to 9/11, and the majority of the terrorists allegedly were from there. So it seems like total double standards. What about that, Brian Becker? What really is this all about in your perspective?
Well, the protection of civilians is a useful pretext. It's a public rationale, public justification. Let's not forget that in 2011, the Obama administration, and Hillary Clinton was right there as a main cheerleader, forced the resolution through in the Security Council, Resolution 1973, authorizing the use of military force in Libya to protect civilians, because they said there was going to be an imminent massacre of civilians. Now, Russia and China abstained, I think very mistakenly at that time, giving the U.S. a green light, Britain, France, and the United States. So they bombed Libya, and they bombed it and bombed it and bombed it, and they weren't done bombing until they had overthrown the government of Gaddafi, an independent nationalist government, and until he was executed. In other words, the protection of civilians is a pretext. The U.S. government used the same thing for the invasion of tiny Grenada in 1983. I mean, you can't go in and say, hey, we're gonna bomb this country because we have interest in taking over oil and carrying out the exploitation of a resource-rich and geostrategically important part of the world. You have to give it a noble goal, a noble objective to sell it to the public. These are public rationales. In Mosul, 200 civilians, babies, many of them babies, not maybe the majority babies and young children, were just slaughtered by the U.S. bombing, reckless bombing in a dense urban area, the second largest city of Iraq. No big outcry by the U.S. mainstream media, no outcry by the Trump administration. The Trump administration said it's going great. It's called the liberation of Mosul. But when the Syrian government is fighting al-Qaeda, the same type of forces in Idlib, then the United States government says, oh, We're protecting civilians once again. Of course, it's about politics. The U.S. wants to dominate Iraq or fragment Iraq. It wants to dominate Syria or fragment Syria. It wanted to dominate Libya or fragment Libya, and it's succeeding in those goals.
Peterson, how significant is it that Trump has turned on his constituents and has actually done what he said he would not do, and how is that going to affect them, you think?
Well, I think that his constituents are probably going to back him anyway. I think they see this in terms of it being what it is, an attack by a country under Assad's orders that used chemical warfare against its own people. It is an extraordinary act, the U.S. response, but I don't see it as a major shift in policy. And I believe that this is something that was directed for a very specific reason, not part of a broader policy. If it was part of a broader policy, you would see the U.S. striking at many targets. And I believe what the U.S. is doing in Iraq is that they have investigated this, and one aspect of the investigation is that one of the Iraqis calling in coordinates called it in on the wrong spot. But be that as it may, and whether that proves true or not, this war is being fought by Iraqis for their own liberation. The U.S. role is very minor, and they will have their own heroes, and they will have their own monuments to their own people when they finish this war, and they are closing in.
And if Iraqis are killed in the middle, they're fighting their own war, and if Iraqis are killed in the middle by the Americans, it's just more Iraqis. That has been happening since 2003, actually, since the invasion. So collateral damage, is that correct, sir?
No. No, it's not. No, it's not correct, because these things are called in. They don't just happen. They don't just bomb indiscriminately at all. There's a lot of work to find a target. But
then you said the U.S. is investigating. So the U.S. can investigate itself, but it does not allow any kind of international entity to investigate the situation in Syria.
Well, it's pretty hard for any international agency to work in a war zone.
I believe Mosul is a war zone, sir. I believe Mosul is a war zone. I believe Daesh is also there. Brian Becker, let's look at the situation. It appears now that Trump then has basically allied himself with the terrorists in Syria, because if we look at the situation, who is going to benefit from this? Then obviously it would be the terrorists on the ground, that the Syrian military was becoming more and more victorious. And then we have the U.S. then actually attacking the air base that was the most effective in that area. So what does all of this mean? Is the U.S. against terrorism? Is the U.S. against Daesh? Or do they work with the terrorists?
Right, and let's just look at one other sort of fact, a circumstantial fact. If that was the air base that the Syrian airplanes were using to carry out chemical strikes against parts of the Syrian population, why would you bomb those same areas? Because they would presumably have chemical weapons, munitions there. But that aside, the United States didn't just send these 59 or 70 cruise missiles against Syria. The American government has intervened in Syria illegally. There's a sovereign government. It sits at the United Nations. It has not invited the United States Air Force or its commandos to be in Syria, and yet the U.S. Air Force is bombing Syria. It's bombing Syria almost every day, just as it's bombing Iraq every day. The cruise missile strikes were something different because they directly targeted the Syrian Arab Army government positions, but don't mistake the idea that because that happened, the United States isn't bombing Syria all the time and working with other forces, other armed groups in Syria, especially in the eastern part of the country. They are. So the real goal here is, from my point of view, is this. The United States have been made irrelevant by the near closure of the war. Turkey, Iran, Russia, but particularly Russia and Iran were helping to be the guarantors for a peace process. That peace process had negotiations going on, including the opposition groups or parts of it, not excluding Daesh and Al-Qaeda. But that was going on, and that was near completion. And then the U.S. was out of that by bombing the Syrian Arab Army positions and struggling to be the ones to take Raqqa in the eastern part of the country. U.S. imperialism is moving back into a position of relevance for the outcome of the Syrian war, which means that the U.S. will want something from that, a zone of influence in Syria, just as they have a zone of influence in the northern part of Iraq. And
okay, unfortunately, Brian, I'm out of time. I appreciate both my guests being with me. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Answer Coalition, Brian Becker, Washington, D.C. Independent scholar, Peter Sinnott out of New York. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another debate. Make sure you join us right here, same time, same place tomorrow. I'm Marcia Hashmi signing off with the crew right here in Tehran. Thanks and goodbye.